Welcome. In the third round of the Bundesliga Championship tournament, we played against the team of Werder Bremen. The match ended with a 6-2 in favor of Bremen, which was quite close to the expected score before the match. I played against the almost 2700 Grandmaster Luke McShane. Luke was a very intriguing opponent for me because when I was a child, many people were already talking about him as a child prodigy. Moreover, I studied quite a few games of his, which are covered in the excellent books of Jonathan Rawson. I chose my pet move knight f3, and he went for a type of Sicilian structure with an early g6, and now allowed me to get this typical Maroczy pawn center, which is a structure which I generally like to play with white. Now, this was not really what I had expected for the game, but still I was not unhappy to see that. So he took on d4. This is one line which is, I think, not the main line, but which is quite popular. And the main idea is that black wants to force me to take back with a queen. Because usually in these structures, if white has already played bishop e3, then you can take back this knight with a bishop. And here I'm forced to take back with a queen. Now, of course, threatening e5, so he has to prevent that. And now he just goes for the normal setup again with bishop g7. White has different plans here. So one plan that comes to mind is to go bishop g5 followed by queen d2. And the other plan is to go bishop e3 followed by queen d2. I chose the latter, bishop e3. And now after castles, I have to go queen d2 because, say after castles, I just lose this extremely important bishop on e3. He has the pair of bishops and just better position. So therefore, I have to go queen d2, and he goes and plays an immediate a5. So the idea of a5 is to go a4 next, grab space on the queen side, and then go queen a5. And it's like a structural way of playing. So black goes for a very easy kind of plan right now. It's just going to go a4, queen a5, bishop e6, rook fc8, pretty much no matter what I do. And it's now up to me to find a good setup against that. While I didn't prepare this line for this game, I think I had seen something like this in the preparation for a previous game. So after queen a5, I now chose one setup that is decent with rook b1 and rook c1. So rook a b1 and now rook fc1. He went for rook fc8, and I played the move b4, which I think I still remembered from my preparation for a previous game. After taking, he went for the move queen to b4. So this is the first critical position, and in this position, the main move for white is the move rook to c2. I didn't know that, and I also didn't play the move rook to c2. The idea of rook to c2 is to control the square on a2 with the rook, and also to protect the queen with the rook, so that in the next move, white can go knight to b5. And then the position remains pretty complicated. So instead of doing that, I went for a much more direct approach, namely to go knight to d5 here. Now this leads to a very sharp line if black wants to, and my opponent wanted to, as he was the better player. So he went for queen takes d2, bishop takes d2, and now he went for rook a2, which leads to very, very crazy and sharp complications. What he could have done instead, if he wanted to play it safe, is to take on d5, take back, and now, either going rook takes c1 or even rook a2, which probably leads to a position that should be close to a draw after d takes e6, and rook c1, and now something like bishop d4 check, king f1, rook d2, and now let's say I can take, rook d1, takes, and draw agreed. So I was thinking that he's probably going to go for such a line, or just to take on d5 and then play it a bit more safely with a move bishop d7, keeping more pieces on the board. But of course, even here I can just trade down, for instance, by taking, and now similarly just going rook c1, and the position is just equal. So therefore, understandably, my opponent was looking for a way to spice things up, and he found a very amazing resource. So actually, while he was thinking, I was also calculating that, because it's probably his only active try to play for a position which is not entirely drawish. So therefore he went with the move rook a2. Wow, amazing move. I didn't think the move was good during the game. I'm not sure whether the move is good right now even, but it's definitely quite complex to play against it. So at first glance it might look like, okay, I win, just win material by taking this rook on c8, but he has rook takes d2, and now he attacks both my bishop on e2 and my knight on c8. But at this point in time, I already have one pawn, plus I have the rook, and he just has two pieces. I will win a second pawn, so materially the position should be fine. And in that sense, I was thinking when I calculated this line that this position should be probably better for white, and at least also easier to play for white. But now that the position was on the board, it was no longer so clear to me whether this assessment is correct. Well, I went for the move knight takes d6, which is, I think, the logical and principled move in the position. The main idea is that if he goes rook takes d6, I have e5, and he will lose material, because after rook d2 I have e takes f, and now I'm still attacking this bishop on g7, and therefore he cannot take my knight on d6. If he takes my bishop on e2, then, for instance, I can go king f1, chasing away the rook, and now after rook a1, maybe I will just follow the rook to get a draw. So if you go something like rook b2, I can follow the rook, but I could also play on by taking on b7 at some point. So, and he doesn't really want to take here, because now this pawn is quite weak, and in the end I will have these two strong passed pawns with a rook against the minor pieces, and if anyone can play for a win, it's white. So therefore, he didn't go for rook takes e2, and also not for rook takes d6, but for this amazing move, knight h5, once more keeping the tension in the position. So he still attacks both of my pieces, and this makes it a bit tricky now for me to play. Because of course, if I go something like king f1 here, this doesn't really work, because he can still keep the tension and go knight d4 with still this double attack. And yeah, this is quite scary. So for instance, if I take here, he can take on e2, attacking g2, and I can never go g3 because he has just bishop h3, and then he's just going to mate me. So this can end very soon. Therefore, after knight h5, I thought for some time and rejected this king f1 opportunity, which led to black's advantage. And I didn't find what is probably the best move in the position, and that would have been the move bishop to d3. A little bit counterintuitive, because the bishop still remains attacked, but I at least deflect the rook from d2. So if he takes on d3, then I have different options. First one would be just taking on b7 with probably a decent position for white. So I have now 3 pawns, and it's not so clear how he wants to attack here, but this still looks a little bit scary, at least from a human eye, to allow, now let's say, some attack which goes like this. Maybe the g pawn is going to advance, and it looks a little bit scary. But I think objectively that's maybe what I should do here. So instead, What I could also do if I just want to draw is to just chase the rook down, and he probably has nothing better than to run away and take the draw. So after knight h5, best way of playing would most likely have been bishop d3. Another thing to take into account after bishop d3 is that knight f4, with the idea of taking on g2, now runs into rook c2, when now after takes, let's say knight b7, I have a big advantage compared to the lines we are going to see, namely that the rook is on the second file and therefore prevents an invasion of the black rook to the very second file. So therefore bishop d3 would have been the way to play. Instead, I went for the move bishop to f1. My thinking was, well, if he wants to attack my king, as long as I have a bishop on f1, it will be very difficult to break through, because if he has some, like later on, ideas with knight f4 and rook g2, then I have prevented all of this already right now with the bishop on f1. I think bishop f1 is also a decent move, but bishop d3 would have been a bit more direct and ambitious. Okay, he took, and I went for rook d1, with now having the idea of exchanging the rooks. He ran to the a file. Note that I cannot chase the rook on the a file because the bishop is taking the a1 square, and so I decided to go c5. When calculating this position, I thought it's probably fine for white as well, so he went for rook a8, and I now went for the move bishop to c4. Yeah, so this is another quite committal decision right now. I just said, okay, I want this bishop to protect the g2 square, but on the other hand, this is also quite a strong piece, this bishop on e6, because the bishop on e6 controls the square d7, which would be a very nice square for my rook, and also puts some pressure on the pawn on b3. I thought, well, if he takes, I'm just going to take back b takes c, attack on b7, and I was thinking that once I get the b7 pawn, with just this limited amount of material, white can never be in any real danger. If I take on b7, maybe get rook d7 in, then in the worst case it's going to be a draw, but I can never be in any real danger. Which might be true as well, so my opponent went for knight f4, allowing me to exchange the bishop on the e6 square, and now he took back on e6, attacking my pawn on c5. I went for b4, and my opponent chose to give a check on d4, to which I replied king to h1 with a draw offer. So at this point, after calculating all of these crazy lines, both of us were a little bit short on time, and especially he had only 4 minutes left, and I knew that he had played a 6-hour game, or more than 6-hour game, with a very long defense in the morning against Heimann. So I was just trying to see how he feels about making a draw in such a really double-edged position right now, just having 4 minutes on the clock. I was slightly surprised that he accepted the draw, just because he's the better player. But during the game, I also thought that the position is probably at least okay, if not better for white. So this judgment is quite definitely wrong. So this position is absolutely fine for black. And yeah, I think we both misjudged this to a certain degree. So now, after the game, we analyzed this a little bit, and he suggested that he would have played the move g5. And g5 is quite strong because it takes control over the black squares. And in principle, the only problem that black has in this position is that the construction with the knight on e6 and the bishop on d4 is quite loose. So if I manage to kick them away somehow, then my pawns can suddenly run very quickly and one of them might queen. So Therefore, g5 is quite strong, preventing me from going f4. And we were analyzing some lines along the line of rook d3, h5, and then maybe g3, followed by maybe f4. And we thought this is just a very complicated position. So put it on the board, let's say g3, h4, and maybe f3. And it's indeed quite a complex position, which should be objectively, let's say some line like this, should be objectively around equal. There is one funny trick sometimes. After rook a2, I sometimes can't go f5 because of knight to g5. And then if I take on d4, he has some knight f3 with an attack on d4 and the threat to play rook to h2 mate. So that's an interesting trick to keep in mind. So now that I analyzed the game with the computer does not like a rook d3 so much, and now comes up with a very, very interesting plan for black. And the plan is to get rid of this very loose structure here with the knight on e6 and the bishop on d4. And the plan is to go rook to a2, rook to c2, and then rook to c4, gaining more control over the d4 bishop. And it's quite difficult for white to play against that. So given that, after g5, maybe the strongest move in the position for white would have been to just go rook dc1, with the idea of playing c6 at some point and liquidating. So let's say some line like king to e7, maybe rook c2, and then at some point I play c6 and liquidate to a position where I have this passed pawn, but he has good control over the king side, and therefore I think the position is close to a draw. Well, thanks a lot for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you for the next video.
When you have stress, play chess. When you fall on your ass, play chess for a real deal, for Christian Seed.